Welcome to the Path to CPO, where we peel back the layers of success and delve into the journeys of the most dynamic Chief People Officers. I'm your host, Nelson Sibalingam, CEO and co-founder of How Now. Together, we'll explore the trials, the triumphs, and insights of these trailblazers across people, culture, and HR at some of the fastest growing companies in the world. This is not just their story, it's a roadmap for all aspiring people leaders. Tune in, rise up, and let's embark on this enlightening journey together. Lara, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nelson. It's great to be here.
I'm excited to take you down memory lane. So let's start with, what was your first job in HR?
Oh, I was a technical college recruiter in the .com heyday, 1998.
Right. And you loved it so much that you never wanted to leave HR?
As every little kid growing up says, I just want to go to be in HR. No, I did love it. And what I realized what I loved about that job, but I wound up going into the HR business partner realm though, was I loved being able to understand the business and what we were doing and sell that vision to candidates, right? And talk about it. And so that to me was always part of what I loved about HR is companies exist because their employees make them possible. Right, and doing that. And so to me, I found it as being a great enabler to the success of the business and the companies that I've worked for and supported. So I've gone through a couple different paths in what I've done in HR, but it was definitely a good fit for me.
So you studied history and then you landed in HR. So tell me, how did that happen?
Well, it's a long story and I'll try to keep it somewhat concise, Nelson, but I, for years, thought I was going to be a lawyer. I really wanted to be a judge. And so I set out high school and university in the States and said, hey, I'm going to be a history major. I'm going to go to law school. This is going to be amazing. And towards the end of my university career time there, I actually started looking at what a lawyer would be, like what I would have to do on a day-to-day basis, and realized as much as I would love law school, being a lawyer sounded miserable. Oh gosh, what am I going to do? So I studied the course catalog and I was trying to figure out just what are the things that really just piqued my interest that I kept going back to. And I found that there was a bunch of courses in the business school under human resources and management of organizational behavior, very fancy name, that combined some of the legal aspects. It combined analytics, it combined psychology, right? And how you kind of reward individuals and problem solving. And those things all just really piqued my interest. So I wound up taking a bunch of those courses in my senior year. I graduated with the history degree because I didn't want to stay and kind of go back on that. And I do really still love history and all that side. But that is then like a good liberal arts major. I went into recruiting, right? Because that's a lot of times what you do in trying to solve those things. So it definitely was not what I had intended to do, but as we look through it, I'm sure we'll talk about my history as I look back now in my career. I'm really glad that I'm not a lawyer. I work with a lot of them, I enjoy them, but I really like what I get to do better on that side and think I'm much happier with having kind of made that shift in that career change.
And so you mentioned earlier around going from recruiting to kind of HR business partnering. So what kind of drove that decision to go into business partnering, and how did you find it? How did you find that transition?
Yeah, it's interesting. I wound up, I tend to not be afraid of change is one of the things you'll learn about me, Nelson, as we talk through this. And I wound up trying the recruitment side. I was like, there's some other things I find interesting. Let me try comp for a little bit. So I did that for like 6 months and realized that was not also my happy place. I'm fascinated by it. It was so specialized, right, in the HR field. And I was like, I'm missing that connection back to the close partnership with the business leaders and what's happening. And so that really is what drove me into the HRBP side. I found that my natural kind of curiosity and interest in what we're trying to do and how people are doing their jobs and what's happening and how does that contribute, like I mentioned, kind of to the success of the business and how employees are feeling, just led me into the HR business partner space. It's kind of been, and really is where I grew up, I say, in HR. I wound up in that space for about 12 years at No Rubbermaid, another 6 at Amazon, and just really it was kind of my happy place for the for that really bulk of my HR career, the growing up part, as I like to say, and building that experience.
It's interesting, Lara, you mentioned you're not afraid of change. And that's such an interesting trait because especially right now, a lot of people where there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of kind of ambiguity and intolerance where people don't know how to react to it. And there's a lot of fear of change. Change carries risk. And often you see people not acting or even addressing problems because they're afraid of change. And so I guess, how did you build that tolerance for change? And I guess what are the takeaways there that you think someone else can use to build that tolerance for change?
Tolerance?
Yeah.
Great question. I think it stems really from curiosity. And I'm going to couple that with a different personality trait of mine also. I've always been very curious. I've liked to learn. I was the kid who spent way too much time in museums trying to read everything. And my sister was, oh, come on, you're taking too long on family trips. And I'm also highly competitive. And interesting combination, right, between those two. But what's interesting to me is and I'll credit Adam Grant. I love this quote one of his, which is focus on getting it right, not being right.
Right.
And that competitive nature, right? You ask my spouse, I love to be right. Trust me, he knows very clearly. But with that shift where I'm like, hey, winning is not being right the first time, it's getting it right in the long run, right? In that mental mindset shift from my natural competitiveness coupled with curiosity, which to me underpins empathy. It underpins growth. It underpins trying new things, right? What's the worst that can happen? Sort of mentality. It underpins humility, right? To not think you know everything and know the answers. I actually think those two combined have set me up to be comfortable with change because it's not the end of the world and we're going to try it and we're going to learn. And what is the worst that's going to happen if things go wrong, right? We're going to go, oh, well, that wasn't it. Let's learn from that and try again, and keep going. And that's just made me pretty resilient, I think, in that side where I don't see challenges or failures as that's the end. I'm like, oh, no, look what we learned, Personally, I learned very early on I wasn't going to make the cheerleading squad, but I did learn that I liked field hockey. Right. That's amazing, So that to me has been kind of I think those two things coupled have really helped me be comfortable with that. And I think as mindsets can help people, even if you're not as naturally competitive, right? But focus on that getting it right and that curiosity, to learn and try and learn from your failures is how you grow.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to say that. As a founder, I can really relate to that. I think this idea of what's the worst that can happen, I often find myself now, my kind of framework is to kind of almost mentally experience the worst. And so you've kind of already gone through it mentally. And so now you're taking your actions without that fear because you've already experienced what that was going to feel like. And that visualization of the worst really helps. But that kind of coming back to the curiosity piece, Lara, do you think you can teach curiosity?
It's a good question. I think there's some people who are naturally inclined to it more than others, for sure. All of us have natural inclinations, right, that we're just born with. But I do think if you can't teach the natural inclination, you can teach the behaviors. I do believe behaviors can be taught. And so curiosity might be that you're like, hey, I'm going to give myself a mechanism, right? I was at Amazon for 6 years, so I still sometimes talk about mechanisms of I'm going to ask 5 questions before I make a decision, right? Give yourself some practices, which I believe, if I said it, it's not the natural inherent trait, we'll at least start building those practices where you're like, hey, I'm gonna ask these questions. What's the worst that can happen? Yeah. Scenario plan, the worst, and what are you gonna do to mitigate that, right? That will inherently, I think, build some of those same insights that you get from curiosity in that side. So I do think the behaviors can be learned and applied in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I agree with that. I wanted to go back to, you mentioned kind of Amazon. Obviously, it was a big part of your career with, just over kind of 6 years. Obviously, it being one of the biggest companies in the world. Love to know, what were your kind of key takeaways from a kind of HR perspective? What did you take away from how Amazon does HR?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Amazon is one of the biggest companies in the world. It's also very polarizing in some of their beliefs, right? Which can be very different than some other places. when I think about how Amazon does HR and the things that I really learned and kind of took away from that, I do, and it actually applies to all the business, not just HR, but I do love the data driven, right? And how to kind of actually harness data and use it to help guide discussions and decision making. But I think one of the things that people sometimes don't realize about Amazon that to me, I love on even more so as part of the data driven is one of the quotes is, follow the data, especially though inspect where data and anecdote differ. So if your data is telling you that employees are highly participating in your training, your learning development programs, like you've got a great kind of acceptance rate and ratings at the end of the program, but the anecdotes or what you're hearing is people are like, yeah, I actually couldn't use much of it, right? Or it was kind of a waste of time. Like that's where you're like, oh, well, something's off here. So what's happening, right? To dig into. And I love that, right? Because you can't just blindly follow the data. You can't blindly follow anecdote. You have to look at the two combined on that piece. So I love that. You heard me talk about, I do love the idea of mechanisms, right? And that thoughtful process of planning and like, what are you going to do to make sure if something goes wrong and how to react, and how are you going to make this a repeatable, scalable mechanism or process, right? To make sure you're inspecting these moments, which takes some of the, like I said, it takes some of the like, oh my God, I'm not good at this. But you don't have to be. All you have to do is do these things and you will develop that, right? Or you'll be able to get the insights into it. I think those were all great things. And Amazon also was one of the first places I've been that really was like, hey, it's okay to be wrong as long as you learn from it. And celebrate that. And I love that, right? It's like the progress over perfection. You don't have to wait for 2 years and sit in the background and develop this incredibly perfect model that, by the way, by that time when you launch, it's going to be out of date because things are changing so fast. But you just need to get out there and try. And the intention is to learn, iterate, and get better and do it again.
So you're currently Chief People Officer at ShipBob. And so, at what point did you realize you were ready for the role of a CPO?
Never, probably too late. Sometimes I still wonder. It's actually, I joke about that a little bit, Nelson. I did tell someone, I was like, I could have done this earlier once I got in to do the job, right? I love my path. Like I wouldn't change any of what I've done because it's helped me. Every job has helped me. But what was interesting for me is I actually think, and I'll talk about the shift from Amazon to Epic Games to ShipBob. That was a really important step because that was one of the choices I needed to make, right? I was heading up the HR business partner team for Alexa, tens of thousands of employees globally, right? Kind of working through in a very large company, pretty structured, right? Centralized teams, we would implement a lot in what we were doing. And I was like, okay, do I really want to stay? Do I just want to be a big line VP of HR, right? Large companies, hundreds of thousands of employees. Or do I want to go back smaller scale and take on more parts of HR, right? But a smaller number of employees and what's happening. Right. And that was a big part of my decision to join Epic because I went from just kind of doing the HR business partner side to having total rewards, HR systems, talent management, right? And kind of all of that and pulling it together. And a smaller company, there were 2,000 people compared to the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands at Amazon. But I got to build the system, right? Versus operating successfully within it. And I really enjoyed that. And so that spoke to some of that curiosity, that learning, the things where I love to try new things and try, change. And that is really, I think, what set me up to be ready and successful in the CPO role, at ShipBob. And it served me very well, right? And that kind of transition and being able to connect the dots now. How do you think about the rewards and incentive structures of what you're actually trying to accomplish for employees, right? How do you think about what your HR business partners need to be on the lookout for and working with leaders on, right? And the change that's coming and what's happening. So it's been, I think that was a really valuable step for me to go kind of do something not totally different, that's not fair, but to challenge myself with change and do something that I hadn't done before to really set me up for success. And again, what's the worst that can happen? I learned a lot, all right? And then I wound up at the ShipBob CPO role. So could I have done it sooner? Probably. Am I glad I took the path I did? Absolutely.
What was your kind of approach to learning when you are kind of throwing yourself out of your comfort zone, taking on more responsibilities that you've not done before? What is your approach? How do you go about going, okay, how do I build the skills I need to be able to do this job?
Yeah, it's great. I'm a big believer. I know it's an older model, but I do love it. There's two models that I've kind of really set in my mind. 70-20-10, right? 70% of learning comes from doing. That doesn't mean you ignore the other 30%, right? You have to go research and read about it and then try it and say, well, what models do I use, right? I'm unafraid to Google and be like, oh, I love that one, don't love that one. How do I take that piece and let's see about pulling together and trying it and then saying, hey, this worked or didn't, right? To actually to learn it. Back to that curiosity, ask a lot of questions. So the first time is sitting down with like a comp review, I'm like, okay, let's talk job architecture. Why do you think about it this way? Why does it matter? How do we build out the structure? How do we think about, what I know employees want, right? They want transparency, fairness, consistency, the ability to understand the rules, right? And what's going to happen. Now, as a company, what are we trying to reinforce? And how do you mix those? So just asked a lot of questions, tried a lot of things. And I said this two models. The other model I have been a big fan of is the situational leadership 2 model from Ken Blanchard, which you're probably familiar with. Because it speaks to me when I see my kids learning to ride a bike, right? I'm like, this is just human nature and we're all humans, about I'm super excited, take on something new. Oh gosh, this is hard. I don't know if I'm gonna be good at this. Okay, maybe I don't want to do it. Oh no, I got this, right? And kind of that skill set as you go through the learning process and just knowing that, where I'm like, it's gonna suck a couple for a little bit while I learn it. That's okay, because I'm gonna come out of it, on that side. So I think for me in learning, it's just keeping that mentality. Don't be afraid to try it, to do it. Look for resources. Understand you're going to go through some confidence gaps, as you're hitting it. But if you keep at it, you will be successful.
When you look back now, what do you know now that you wish you knew when you took on your first HR leadership role?
The change is constant and it's just going to get faster. Right. And I think about that in the past 5 years, right? Even thinking about where I was coming out of from Amazon, when we were talking just about the machine learning with Alexa and kind of all of what was happening and how we were dealing with the globalization and the multinational, all of that stuff, right, into the pandemic, which was a whole change, right, as everyone had to adapt to remote work, to how do you get team building and culture, right, when you're not in person? How do you rethink your meeting processes, right, and effectiveness for communication? That change happened so quickly and then unchanged. And we're like, great, now we can get back together, but we're still remote. What do we do? And how do you optimize it? To even in the past 6 months and thinking about generative AI, right? And people now going, oh my God, what is this going to do? How do we now know a candidate actually did this? How do we know an engineer wrote this code versus just pulled it off? Fascinating. I'm so fascinated by all of that. The change is constant and it's fast, I think, are the real things I wish I'd known. And just that's where you got to roll with it, right? Don't assume that perfect plan. You're never going to have a perfect plan because it's going to change by the time you're done with it.
So looking forward, Lara, what keeps you up at night? What are the kind of challenges facing HR and people teams today that keep you up at night?
So I do think the generative AI right now is very front of mind to me for a couple of reasons. I'm not scared of it, but it's just thinking through like how are we gonna tackle it and do it. There's the privacy and employee trust side of it, right? How do we think about it from a privacy perspective, from an IP perspective? How do we think about what information belongs to who, right? When you feed it into these models, right? And how do you go forward and all of that? And how do we control that, right? Or control, if we ever can, but how do we manage that for employees? Yeah. I think about the excitement of it could completely change how we work, right? So if it takes some of that, that repetitive tactical nature of the work that we don't love,
right,
and do it to free you up for the other work, that's amazing. I also think about what's going to be the future of entry-level jobs, right? Where a lot of entry-level jobs are some of that tactical, repetitive. Yeah. How do you actually build that capability of of new hires and new college graduates and that new joiners into being able to learn, right? Is it more apprenticeships? Like, what are we going to be thinking about? Like, I think that is fascinating to me of just how this is going to impact just the pace of change and all of that on that side, which is really interesting. I think the other things that keep me up is tangential. I can never say that word to that, but is how do we make sure employees are surviving the pace of change too?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot. If I'm thinking about all of this, right, and all that, so are they, right? And they're like, oh my God, are my kids gonna have jobs? How are we gonna do this?
Yeah.
All of my work will change, right? All of this, and how can we help employees with that resilience, right? And that, and I know you've done a lot of the upskilling and changing, right? And changing the nature of the work they do and being comfortable with that. So I do worry that we have to keep an eye on that as well. And I think that's going to be one of the, I won't say afterthoughts, but it's hard. That's one of the hardest things to think about, not just the application of it, but what's the impact, the emotional impact, right, to employees.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier, Lara, about kind of curiosity. It becomes almost fundamental in this kind of environment where, rather than letting fear hold you back, it's having a curiosity to play with it, try to break it, see what you can do with it. And I think the great thing, again, we work a lot, the last kind of 6-7 years, we've been working with AI. And I think the great thing about it is, especially with this new kind of natural language interface, if you don't know how to do something with it, you can ask it, right? And that's the great thing about it. It's kind of almost breaking away those barriers of, programming language. Actually, now this thing can speak a language that you know how to speak. And I think it is a paradigm shift in the way we kind of interact with it. I wanted to kind of touch on another area, which is ShipBob being recognized as one of the best companies for women to work in. And I wanted to get your take on, what are kind of some of the practical things organizations can do to build an inclusive workplace?
Oh my gosh. I'm going to go super basic with this because I think sometimes we overcomplicate things in the HR and people space. I do believe people are humans, all of us, and there's certain things we want. We want transparency and expectations, right? What's expected of me in my role? How am I doing? Transparency and feedback and communication, and consistency, I think, is the other one, right? What is the expectations for everybody? How are we talking about it? Can we talk about our decisions and why we're making the decisions we are? And I think if you can do those, you will inherently build a more inclusive culture, because then you start building trust, right? That transparency and clarity really is the foundation to me of trust between employees and managers and companies, right? If we can't tell employees why we're doing what we're doing, if we can't also admit when we screwed up, hey, we thought this program was going to do this, it didn't, so we're changing it. Great, that shows that I think that willingness to take a look at it. That trust gives psychological safety. It gives the ability to try new things, to learn. And to me, that is when you start building the inclusive environment, because then everyone's like, hey, I'm going to try this, right? And get the chance at it. And they understand what that's going to be, what's the impact of it if they succeed or fail on that piece. And so I don't think it's rocket science. I don't think it's really fancy programs. I think we need to take actions when we have gaps and fix them 100% on that side. But one of the things, or I should say the things I think that helps really ShipBob be a great place for women is that we're super transparent. We share a lot with employees universally, right? As a company, here's what we're headed for. Here's what we're working on. Here's where the hits and misses, right? And talking about it. And I love that our co-founders are very transparent and upfront, right? And talking with employees. We're very open door. You can talk about anybody. We want to solve problems and fix them. And I think that's really what's helped, right? Because people do feel like they know what's happening. They know what's going on and know what's kind of expected of them and how things are done. And that just makes you feel like you can contribute.
And, when you say it like that, transparency, consistency, it sounds so obvious, but why do you think so many organizations struggle with being transparent and consistent? Where do you think the kind of blockers are? Well, what's stopping companies from doing this?
I think fear is a big one, right? You're afraid of how people are going to react. You're afraid, hey, we can't be transparent and say we got it wrong. People are looking to us. They trust us. They won't trust us anymore. I'm like, oh no, they know exactly what's happening. And when you are not honest, they don't trust you for that, right? Like, because they know you're human too, right? And what you're doing and talking about on that side. But I do think that fear is a big one. People won't trust us anymore. Hey, how am I going to be able to, oh my gosh, pay transparency? Think about that, right? We've had in the States, a lot of different states that have gone with you have to post. the salary ranges on a
Right.
job description,
Yeah.
right? And total fear, right? Oh my gosh, well then how am I going to explain to somebody, one of my current employees, that they're not at the top of the range? How am I going to negotiate with the candidate that their offer is not at the top of the range? I'm like, because you're going to be honest with them, right? That's why. And they have a decision to make. And if you're clear about it, here's the requirements, here's where you fall, here's why you're at the midpoint. We think you're really qualified. You're not right above. That's okay. You have room to grow. That I think is where that fear comes in. I'm not going to be able to explain it. I'm like, well, if you're honest, you will, and employees will value that.
Yeah.
So yeah. I think it's that fear.
All right, Lara, I can keep going. I probably have to get you back on the show again, but I do want to now move to our quick fire round. So I'm going to fire a few questions at you, and I'm going to get some quick answers back. Are you ready?
I hope so. We'll find out.
All right, what's your best productivity hack?
I turn off notifications on Slack and my phone, and that when I need to focus for a few hours and really think and get something done, I just can't look. I can't see the little flashing lightning and Slack's popping up and the emails in my phone. I turn them all off.
Yeah, that's a good one. Favorite book or podcast?
I really like Brene Brown and kind of her different ones in Dare to Lead. And I love that she's introduced me through that podcast to a couple other leaders who I do follow, right? Like Adam Grant, Simon Sinek, some of the others. So that's always a good one for me because it's different topics. We have a similar mindset about curiosity and failure, right? And that I like her work on vulnerability and all that. So she's one of my go-tos.
The best piece of advice you've ever been given?
It's always been some vein of, like we talked about earlier, what's the worst that can happen, right? And my sister is the one who always says this to me. I'm like, oh, I don't know. Should I take this new thing? Should I try this new thing? She's like, what's the worst that can happen? You're going to learn through it. You're not going to fail. I was like, but I could. She's like, no, if you do, you just fix it and then you won't fail the next time. You haven't failed. So I think that is that, like, what's the worst that can happen, right? I think that versus being afraid.
The next one, Lara, is a selfish one. I'm going to be a new parent next month. And so, thank you. And I want to get a parenting wisdom from you. What's the best bit of parenting advice you can share?
Oh my gosh. So this one hopefully this will tell you a lot about me in that desire to be right, where someone's like, with my husband, who's like, if you're going to trust him, you have to trust him. Just because he doesn't do it your way doesn't mean that it's not okay. Yeah. And I've learned that, and it's fine. I was like, yep, kids are alive, they're fed, everything's fine. I don't have to worry about it. And so it's a little bit of that letting go with your co-parent and that side, because you both have got different ways you were raised and thoughts, and it's going to be okay. They're also, I will tell you, they're incredibly resilient little critters on that side. So that's good.
Last one for you, Lara, is what are you most proud of?
This is hard. I tend to focus on what I need to get better at all the time. So when I think about what I'm most proud of, I don't know, I guess it's just, I never set out with a plan to be where I am, right? Like I'm one of those, I was always like, if I just work really hard and do a good job at what I'm doing, it's always kind of come forward and happened for me. And I guess I have to say I'm proud of my ability to work, right, and learn and do that. And it's got me to a spot that I'm really happy with.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Lara. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Nelson. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to another brilliant episode of L&D Disrupt, the podcast that's powered by How Now. Our learning experience platform helps companies bring relevant learning and skills into the flow of work to make meaningful learning a part of everyday work. But don't just take our word for it. Here's what some of our customers have to say. And if you like what you hear and want to learn more about How Now, just use the link in the description to book a demo. As a loyal L&D Disrupt listener, we'll send you a swag pack containing a copy of the book Learning at Speed and some How Now merch once we've shown you around.
And we needed somewhere to have a central home for all of the learning content that was being created at pace. And we also really wanted to support a modernised learning. So moving to that 70-20-10 model, where learning is really integrated into the flow of work at the point of need. And we knew that How Now would be the perfect platform to support with that modernised approach.
And I was confident that How Now was right for FitFlop because it passed the eyeball test at the Learning Technologies Conference, number one. Does it look like it's going to be user-friendly and people might actually want to use it? My previous companies, I'm used to using very clunky LMSs that don't do much to help with engagement.
We've just launched How Now, actually, where I am at the moment with Lucid Group, and what we've focused on is the building of habits around learning. So trying to get people into healthy and regular habit of learning so that it becomes an everyday activity as opposed to something they have to take lots of time out. We're very time poor. The tools they've got, the information they need is where they need it at the point. So integrating into Microsoft Teams as we use it, or any other collaboration tool, making sure that any learning is accessible at their point of need. So where they can ask a search first question and then we can provide them the information they need straight away.